emojis are. American investment often comes with legal and humanitarian strings attached, enabling the less picky Chinese to invest their way into influence in second and third tier, and a not small number of first-tier countries the world over. The raw material producers of the world, from South Africa and Australia to Russia and Saudi Arabia, now consider the Chinese market the most important market in the world. Whether it's China's rapid growth in oil imports, making up 15.5% of global imports in 2018, or its singular control of the soybean import market, 59% of total imports, Chinese consumption seems to be the only consumption that matters. China produces nearly half of two little pillars of civilization called steel and aluminum, and has near total control over the production of rare earth metals, which can be found in everything from advanced fighter planes to renewable utilities. The Chinese government is unafraid to wield the power of the state to let its geopolitical competitors know of its displeasure. In recent years, it has limited the outflow of tourists to South Korea and rare earth metals to Japan, as well as limiting the inflow of soy from the United States and steel from the European Union. China, it would seem, holds all the cards. Such sentiment isn't simply wrong, but hilariously so. Global domination isn't an entry-level course. To be blunt, the Chinese are doing it wrong. The American system of global management can be summed up as entice everyone to be on your team. Sufficient allure to draw everyone to your global system is not easily attained. The American order is in essence based on bribes. Think of the American management strategy as having 4 carrots of success. Carrot 1, ensure physical security for all. The order's primary benefit was absolute security for every country. The United States would protect all order members from the military advances of order and non-order members alike. But the first piece of this process is something most who advocate for a post-American world gloss over: gaining trust. A would-be hegemon must prove it is willing to bleed to protect the interests of every member of its new order. The reason the Americans became entangled in wars in Korea and Vietnam was less to stop the march of communism than to convince America's allies that the country would never step away from a fight to protect their interests. The 2 Asian wars were primarily fought to keep Japan and France in America's coalition. Japan being concerned that there would be no American footprint on the Asian mainland without South Korea, and France being Vietnam's former colonial master. It is a bit of a hoot to imagine the Chinese maintaining Checkpoint Charlie to protect the Germans from the Russians or getting involved in the Persian Gulf to keep the Iraqis out of Kuwait. Anyone who wants to guarantee the security of others must first convince those others that such protection includes protection from the new would-be hegemon itself. As distrusted as the Americans may be around the world, they are still the only significant power that most want defending them. The reason is simple. The Americans are not their neighbors. Except for Mexico and Canada, the Americans border none of their wards. Such distance means any historical bad blood between the Americans and others is fairly thin. Few countries have ever faced an American occupation. Such is most certainly not the case for the Chinese. In contrast to the Americans, who have only been around since 1776, and in a strategically significant sense since about 1895, the Chinese enjoy showcasing their millennia of history. Yes, such cultural longevity is an accomplishment worth celebrating, but also opens a trap. The Chinese have had a long time to burn bridges and ring themselves with enmities. The Americans have had meaningful long-term issues only with Canada and Mexico, countries with which it, by Chinese standards, enjoys cordial relations. A quick look around China's neighborhood. Whenever the northern Chinese have ever consolidated sufficiently to invade someone, the first direction they've marched is toward the Korean peninsula. But the Koreans are no longer pushovers. In the 21st century, the peninsula is bristling with soldiers and nuclear weapons. There's no military walkover here. Taiwan's hostility to mainland China long predates the Chinese Civil War of the 1920s to 1950s. The island of Formosa has long served as either a redoubt for this or that Chinese dynasty, or a rebel or warlord force, or as a power center in its own right. Today it is both. The Kazakhs, knowing the Chinese think of them as uncouth, horse-riding barbarians, moved their capital from the near border city of Almaty to the former Soviet gulag of Astana, while also getting buddy-buddy with the Russians to achieve a degree of insulation and protection from Beijing. That's worth underlining. The Kazakhs would rather be beholden to their former Soviet masters than integrated with China. Japan has been the traditional regional bugaboo of the Chinese for the past handful of centuries, and Japan's at times brutal raiding and/or occupation of much of the Chinese coast and northern interior regions leaves the Chinese itching for revenge. That's hardly the sort of thinking that earns one friends in Tokyo. India still smarts over territory lost to China under Mao, an experience that prompted New Delhi to develop its nuclear forces and point them at China. China's relationship with Russia is even more damning. The Russians' 18th and 19th century Asiatic expansions brought the sharp end of Russian power deep into China's business. Russian forces occupied what are now the modern Chinese provinces of Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, Heilongjiang, Jilin, and Liaoning, the last serving as Beijing's access to the open ocean. The ill feelings are hardly ancient history. In the 1950s, Stalin approved a war on China's doorstep, knowing full well that if the Americans came, the Chinese would feel compelled to act. The Americans came, the Chinese intervened, and then Stalin charged his socialist brethren for the weapons the Chinese needed to fight it. In the 1960s, the Soviets took a straw poll to see if anyone would mind them nuking Beijing. The Americans were alone in saying no, paving the way for the Nixon-Mao summit of 1972. After the Soviet Union's end in 1991, the Kremlin bluntly warned that, should a rising China think it could seize Siberia from a falling Russia, that Russian resistance wouldn't take the form of tanks or artillery or partisans, but instead nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. The best example of the difficulty the Chinese face in establishing trust is the country that provided the Americans with their most memory-searing war, Vietnam. Agent Orange, napalm, the Christmas bombing of Hanoi. America's war in Vietnam was messy and angry and lasted for 2 decades. In contrast, the Han fought the Vietnamese for 2 millennia. In 2020, the Vietnamese are eager to welcome American business people and carriers because they don't think the war with the United States lasted long enough to qualify Americans as epic foes. In contrast, the Vietnamese view of China borders on the pathological. Of course, it isn't as if the Chinese are the only significant country that has trouble earning regional, much less global, trust. Iran defending Saudi Arabia? Or Saudi Arabia defending Iran? German or Russian troops on Polish soil? Japan in charge of Chinese security? It isn't just that the Chinese can't displace the Americans as global security guarantor, it's that no one can. Carrot 2. Ensure maritime security for all. The Americans offered twin promises. They could and would deploy forces anywhere in the world on short notice to defend the order, and they could and would guarantee absolute protection of all allies' merchant shipping. These promises required the Americans to patrol all seas at all times. Anyone wanting to displace the Americans as the hegemon of a globalized world would have to do the same. No one can. The core problem is capability. America's global position throughout the order is a direct outgrowth of the country's naval dominance at the end of World War II. In late 1945, the American Navy was not simply on a wartime high in terms of force strength, experience, and deployment reach. The world's other navies were pretty much gone. It wasn't that the Americans could sail anywhere they wanted unmolested, although they could and did. It was that in the war's aftermath, all the world's good naval anchorages were momentarily unoccupied. The Americans spent the next 30 years entrenching themselves in ideal ports the world over, while refashioning their naval forces to take maximum advantage of the new basin footprints. It took until the mid-1970s for the Americans to finally float their first modern supercarrier, the USS Nimitz, the first ship with the speed, range, power, and flexibility required to make the most of the basing sites the Americans had already controlled for a generation. The United States was now not only the sole undisputed global naval power, it now floated individual battle groups that were more powerful than not only the entire Soviet Navy, but arguably more powerful than all the world's other blue water vessels combined. The Americans likely hold that distinction in 2020, although there's a healthy debate in defense circles about whether the soon-to-be operational British and Japanese carriers might prove capable of tilting the balance. During the next 35 years, the Americans gifted the Nimitz with 9 sister ships, and have recently begun deployment of an even more powerful supercarrier class. This multi-decade buildup would have been impossible in the world before 1939, when a half-dozen other significant naval powers floated battle groups and still held most of those anchorages. Any Chinese expansion that would replace, much less overturn, the American position doesn't simply begin after a long American head start, but must overcome an American naval global footprint that would take over a century to establish through force of arms. A footprint that is not replicable without complete victory in a world-spanning war that somehow manages to leave the Chinese mainland untouched. This is meant less as a slam against the Chinese, as it is a recognition of global naval realities. After all, aside from the Americans, no one floats even a single fully functional supercarrier, much less a supercarrier battle group, much less a global naval force. The next largest non-American carriers aren't even really operational. Russia's Kuznetsov appears to like catching on fire. The UK's Queen Elizabeth hasn't yet exited sea trials. India's Vikramaditya is a floating mass of technical problems, and the engines on France's Charles de Gaulle aren't powerful enough to bring it up to aircraft launching speed, except under near-perfect conditions. In fact, the next 9 largest fully operational carriers are also all operated by the US Navy. Much is made of China's Liaoning. It shouldn't be. On paper, the Liaoning has perhaps 1/7 the combat capacity of a Nimitz, and the Chinese didn't build it. The Soviets did, in the 1980s, sort of. This first-of-type vessel was never completed. After the Soviet breakup, the Ukrainians stripped it for parts. The ship then languished, rusting at dock for a decade until the Chinese purchased it. Today, it is used purely as a training platform. China's naval engineering is improving. The 001A, China's domestically manufactured clone of the Liaoning, is undergoing sea trials at the time of this writing, but there are still decades of work to go before China can float something that can compete with a Nimitz. Carrier engineering isn't rocket science. It's a lot harder. Beyond carriers, China is indeed floating an impressive number of missile frigates and destroyers that combine reach and lethality. But what the Chinese fleet lacks is operational range. Of China's 300-plus naval vessels, only 1/9 of them are major surface combatants that can operate over